The hospital doors didn't swing open. They slammed shut in his face. Senator John Kennedy, dressed in a simple navy windbreaker and worn-in leather shoes, stood alone at the entrance of the Louisiana Veterans Care Center, gripping a folded letter in his hand, like it was the last thread tying him to something sacred. "Sir, I've already told you. Step back. You are not authorized to enter," the security guard snapped, his posture rigid, voice louder than necessary. It was the kind of tone reserved for troublemakers, not statesmen. But there was no camera crew, no flashing lights, no entourage, just a quiet man who had driven himself to the facility to see an old friend. The silence behind him was deafening. A few visitors paused mid-step, sensing something off but unsure if they should intervene. Kennedy didn't flinch. His voice was low, deliberate. "I'm here to see a patient, a veteran. He sent me this." He held up the creased envelope, the ink slightly smudged from his fingers. The guard glanced at it, scoffed, and crossed his arms. "Anybody can write a letter. You think I don't know what this is? Some guy trying to sneak in to get free services? Or what, you think just because you say you're a senator, the rules don't apply?" His lip curled. "You got ID?" Kennedy nodded, reached into his jacket, and pulled out both his driver's license and his U.S. Senate ID. The guard snatched them from his hand and held them up to the sunlight like they were fake $20 bills. "This looks printed at Kinko's," he muttered with a smirk, then tossed them back. The senator caught them mid-air with quiet dignity. The security guard stepped closer, lowering his sunglasses, his tone now outright mocking. "If you don't turn around and walk off this property in the next 10 seconds, I'll have you removed. Your name means nothing here." That's when the bystander's phone began to record. From the far side of the entrance, a woman whispered to her teenage son, "Isn't that Senator Kennedy?" The boy nodded. "Yeah, he's the one who helped pass the veterans' bill last year." The mother frowned, pulling out her phone. "Why is no one letting him in?" The camera zoomed in just in time to catch the moment when the guard slapped the letter from Kennedy's hand, and it fluttered to the ground, landing between them like a silent accusation. Kennedy slowly bent to retrieve it. Not with anger, with care, as if it were a flag. The guard raised his voice for everyone to hear. "This man is impersonating a government official and trying to trespass into a federal facility. I don't care what badge he shows me. No ID, no access." The crowd around them grew thicker, people murmuring, unsure what was unfolding but sensing it mattered. A nurse in scrubs pushed her way forward. "I know who he is," she whispered to the guard. "That's Senator John Kennedy. He's been here before." The guard turned on her. "You want to keep your job, or do you want to back up the clown show?" She stepped back, eyes wide with disbelief. Kennedy remained still. His voice, finally, rose, but not in anger, in warning. "You're making a mistake, son. I came here alone, without press, without announcement for one reason, to visit a man I owe my life to. If you stop me from doing that today, it won't be me you'll have to answer to. It'll be your own conscience." But the guard wasn't listening. His pride was too loud. At this point, dear listener, if your jaw's already clenched and your heart's racing, I want you to do something. Hit the like button and comment the number 9 below, because what's about to happen next, it's going to change everything. As Kennedy turned to leave, refusing to fight, the entrance doors suddenly hissed open. A wheelchair emerged. A frail man, his skin pale but eyes burning with recognition, was being pushed forward by a nurse. His voice cut through the air like a blade. "Let that man in," he said, rasping but firm. The crowd parted as if Moses himself had spoken. "He's the reason I'm alive. 40 years ago in Vietnam, he dragged my bleeding body out of a burning tank. I've been waiting to thank him ever since." The security guard froze. His jaw hung open. His hands, which had been hovering near his radio, dropped to his sides. Silence fell over the entrance like a shroud, broken only by the sound of someone's phone still recording, still capturing every stunned expression, every blink of disbelief. The air was different now, heavy with truth. And this was only the beginning. The silence that followed the veteran's words was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing, as if the weight of his voice had pressed pause on the world. The old man's hand, thin and trembling, pointed straight at the security guard. "You should be ashamed of yourself," he said, not with anger, but with profound disappointment. "This man's got more honor in his pinky finger than you'll ever understand standing behind that badge." The nurse behind him tried to steady the wheelchair, but the old veteran was holding himself upright now, with all the force of his fading strength and unbroken spirit. Senator Kennedy stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the man in the chair. "I told you I'd come," he said softly. "Didn't expect it to turn into a scene." The old veteran smiled through the oxygen mask. "You always hated drama," he rasped, "but somehow it finds you anyway." The crowd started to shift, people lowering their phones, some tearing up, others whispering to each other. The tension that once surrounded the entrance had melted, but only for a moment. The security guard, red-faced and stunned, suddenly found his voice again, though it cracked as he tried to use it. I was just following protocol," he stammered. "I didn't know. How was I supposed to know?" A woman from the crowd shot back without hesitation. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't care to know." The door opened wider. The hospital administrator, alerted by the sudden commotion, stepped out in a sharp gray suit, his face pale as he took in the scene. He rushed down the steps, bypassing the security guard entirely, and extended a hand to Kennedy. "Senator, I am so sorry. I didn't realize you were coming today." Kennedy shook his hand, his expression neutral. "I wasn't here to be recognized," he said. "I was here for him." He nodded toward the veteran. "But your man here made sure I wouldn't be." The administrator turned to the guard, eyes sharp. "We'll talk inside." But that conversation would come later. What happened next, no one expected. A teenage boy who had been quietly filming stepped up and asked, "Sir, is it true? You really saved his life in the war?" Kennedy looked at him and nodded, just once. "I didn't think about it then," he said. "It wasn't heroic. It was just the right thing to do." The boy posted the video right there on the spot. In under 5 minutes, it was shared to Twitter. In 10, it hit TikTok with a caption that read, "Security guard blocks war hero reunion? What happens next broke me." Inside the hospital, a room had been prepared. The old veteran, Sergeant Harold Monroe, was rolled back in, with Kennedy now walking beside him. No cameras, no speeches, just 2 men sharing the weight of memories. They laughed about bad food in the field. They cried over names long gone. They talked like no years had passed. Meanwhile, outside, the story exploded. The guard, whose name was soon identified, was placed on immediate leave. His image became the face of disrespect meets power trip across every news platform. Comment sections boiled. Memes followed. He issued a statement on social media 2 hours later, trying to explain, but it only made things worse. "I was just doing my job," he wrote. "Didn't recognize him. Thought he was lying." The internet was merciless. Screenshots flooded Reddit threads. Hashtags like "Why'n't you let the man in?" and "Honor over ego" trended for hours. But Kennedy? He stayed quiet. That night, as the sun set behind the veterans' hospital, Kennedy returned to his car. Reporters waited at the gate, shouting questions, but he raised a hand kindly and said, "Please, not today." He drove off in silence, past the cameras, past the crowd, back into the stillness of a Louisiana night. Inside the hospital, Sergeant Monroe watched the coverage with his nurse. He shook his head and chuckled. "He never wanted to be famous, and look what happens when he just shows up." Outside, people continued to share the story, not because it was scandalous, but because it struck a nerve. In a time when recognition was demanded, when loud voices often drowned out quiet strength, a simple act of decency was finally being seen. Not just by one man in a wheelchair, but by the whole world. And what they did with that truth, well, that was up to them. The following morning, headlines screamed across every major platform, like sirens in digital form. Senator Kennedy denied entry at Veterans Hospital. A hero stopped at the door. The video had reached 10 million views overnight. News anchors replayed the clip of the security guard swatting the letter from Kennedy's hand on a loop, dissecting every expression, every word, every misplaced ounce of pride. Yet while the internet frothed with fury, Kennedy himself remained almost invisible. He hadn't tweeted. He hadn't called a press conference. Instead, he had spent the morning at Sergeant Monroe's bedside, sipping lukewarm hospital coffee and listening to the old man recount stories Kennedy had long tried to forget. Outside the hospital, however, the real storm was gathering. A crowd had begun to form. Veterans, their families, activists, and citizens who simply believed in respect. Some carried American flags. Others held signs that read, "Dignity has no dress code," and "You don't treat a senator like that, but you don't treat anyone like that." The guard, now suspended and hiding from public view, had become a symbol of a deeper wound, one that touched not just politics or veterans' affairs, but the simple erosion of basic human decency. Around noon, Kennedy finally emerged, not through the back, not shielded by aides, but right through the front doors, where the conflict had begun. Reporters surged forward, but he paused on the steps, lifted a hand, and asked, "Would you mind giving me just 2 minutes?" A hush fell over the crowd, not just from respect, but from curiosity. What would he say? He didn't read a statement. He spoke from the heart. "I came here yesterday," he began, "because a man I owe my life to asked me to visit. I didn't come for the cameras. I didn't come to make a point. But a point was made anyway." He glanced towards the door behind him, then back to the crowd. "What happened wasn't about me being a senator. It was about what happens when we stop seeing people. When we look at someone and don't bother to ask their name, their story, their purpose, just make assumptions based on clothes or age or whether or not they fit our idea of important." The crowd was silent. No one even adjusted their phones. "I'm not angry at that young man," he continued. "Truth be told, I've met 1,000 like him. Somewhere along the way, someone told them that authority comes from volume, not from virtue. That uniforms demand obedience, but not respect. That rules matter more than people, but they're wrong. What matters, what's always mattered, is how we treat one another when no one's watching. Except now, someone was watching. You were." A wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd, affirming, supportive, reflective. Kennedy's voice grew quieter, but somehow heavier. "I'm not here to get a man fired. I'm here to make sure we don't forget the moment we all saw ourselves in this story. Because maybe it wasn't about a senator at all. Maybe it was about every elderly veteran turned away, every mother told to wait, every child ignored because they didn't look right to the person behind the desk." He turned toward the hospital now, as if addressing the building itself. "We've got to be better than this." Just then, a young man stepped out from the crowd. Mid-20s, thin, nervous, clutching a faded photo. "Senator?" he called, voice cracking. Kennedy looked at him, nodded. The man held up the photo. "That man, Sergeant Monroe. He served with my grandfather. He always said Monroe saved him. I just wanted to say thank you, for going to see him, for showing up." Kennedy walked down the steps and shook the young man's hand. "Showing up is the least we can do," he said. Back on the internet, the video of Kennedy's impromptu speech, now titled Senator Kennedy's Masterclass on Respect, was already being clipped, quoted, and debated. Some praised him. Others questioned why it took someone with a title to make the story go viral. But most agreed. Something about this felt real. That night, under soft yellow lights in a Baton Rouge community center, Kennedy met with a group of volunteers and hospital administrators. On a simple whiteboard at the front of the room, in black marker, someone had written, "What happens next?" Kennedy stood before them and answered quietly, "We change the culture." But the road ahead wouldn't be paved with applause. Because the real question still lingered. How do you teach dignity in a world that has forgotten how to look someone in the eye? That was the question he carried with him into the night. The next morning, Senator Kennedy sat alone in his modest kitchen, a cup of black coffee growing cold between his hands. He wasn't watching the news, not because it wasn't everywhere, but because he didn't need to. He already knew the story had become something far bigger than him. Overnight, the footage had been translated into 5 languages, stitched into TikToks, turned into commentary clips, reaction videos, and even parodied on late-night comedy shows. But beneath the noise, something more serious had begun to stir. A nationwide reckoning with how frontline workers, not just security guards, but receptionists, clerks, gatekeepers of all kinds, used power without purpose. And now the focus wasn't just on the guard, it was on the culture that had created him. By noon, Kennedy was back at the hospital, not for interviews, but for a private conversation. He had requested to meet the guard, whose name was Miles Dutton. The hospital's legal team advised against it. PR consultants warned it could look like a stunt, but Kennedy didn't care. He wasn't there to stage anything. He was there to listen. They met in a small administrative office. No cameras, no aides, just 2 men and a closed door. Miles looked broken. The bravado from earlier had melted into a pale, sunken posture. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I lost my job. I've had death threats. My family's getting harassed. I didn't know who you were, sir. I just thought—" He trailed off. "I thought you were trying to sneak in." Kennedy didn't interrupt. He waited. "I was trained to treat everyone like a threat until proven otherwise," Miles added. "They told us to assume people lie. That's how you stay safe. That's how you do the job." Kennedy's eyes didn't blink. "And who trained you to assume people deserve dignity?" Miles looked down. There was no yelling, no righteous speech, just silence. And in that silence, a seed was planted. A seed of understanding, not excusing. Kennedy stood slowly and walked to the window, looking out over the parking lot where protest signs still flapped in the breeze. "You know what saved me on that sidewalk?" he asked without turning. A man in a wheelchair who had every reason to stay silent. But he didn't. He spoke up. He remembered. He turned now, voice calm but firm. "And that's what you have to do. Remember, every face that walks toward you is a story. Every person who shows up might be carrying something you don't see. It's not weakness to give someone a moment to explain who they are. It's strength, and you didn't do that." Miles nodded, tears brimming but held back. "I know. I see it now. I wish I could take it back." "You can't," Kennedy said gently. "But you can move forward. Learn from it. Help others do the same. That's how you make it right." He extended his hand. Miles hesitated, then shook it, eyes locked, shame and hope tangled in equal measure. Later that day, Kennedy held a town hall meeting in the hospital auditorium. Not for cameras, but for community members who had shown up simply to be part of the conversation. The room was packed. Veterans in wheelchairs, single mothers, retired nurses, college students holding clipboards. Sarah Monroe, daughter of Sergeant Monroe, stood near the front. She'd flown in after seeing her father on the news, and the moment Kennedy spotted her, His face softened. He took the microphone and didn't speak like a senator. He spoke like a neighbor. "I know we're angry," he said, "and I know some of us feel helpless. But outrage isn't a destination. It's a starting point. So let's use it." He unveiled a new initiative, Project First Look, a grassroots program aimed at training security staff and frontline workers in empathy, communication, and human-first interaction. No politics, no grandstanding, just decency, codified and taught. Volunteers signed up on the spot. And then, a moment no one expected. Sarah Monroe asked to speak. She took the mic, hands shaking, and looked out at the sea of faces. "I watched that video of my dad, telling the world that Senator Kennedy saved his life. But here's the thing, he never told me that story, not once. He never wanted to talk about Vietnam. I thought it was because of the pain. But now I know, it was about honor. He wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting the memory of the people who didn't come home. So if my dad could stand up for a stranger at the end of his life, the least I can do is stand up now." The room erupted in applause, not the explosive kind, but the kind that builds slowly and deeply, clapping not just for her, but for the idea that one voice, one action, could ripple outward. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with streaks of gold and fire. But inside that auditorium, something else was rising, a movement, a mission, and the quiet conviction that maybe the world didn't need more heroes in capes. Maybe it just needed more people who were willing to look, truly look, at one another, and ask, "How can I help you be seen?" And so the story, once born from a standoff at the hospital doors, had begun to transform. No longer about punishment, but about purpose. No longer just about Senator Kennedy, but about all of us. 3 days later, the senator's office was buried in letters. Handwritten notes from veterans in Idaho, voice messages from nurses in Baltimore, emails from security guards across the country who admitted, sometimes with shame, sometimes with pride, that the story had cracked something open inside them. One message stood out. It came from a retired Marine named Tom Price. "Senator, I've been that man, the one behind the badge. I once turned away a woman from seeing her husband in the ICU because she didn't look right. Found out later he passed away that night. I still see her face. I never said sorry. But watching you, I finally picked up the phone. I found her, and I said it." That afternoon, Kennedy sat with Sergeant Monroe for what would be the last time. The old veteran's breathing was shallower now, his voice little more than a whisper. But his mind was clear as glass. "You stirred something, John," he rasped. "Didn't expect you to shake the whole damn country awake." Kennedy chuckled softly. "I just showed up." "No," Monroe said, locking eyes with him. "You stood still. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't pull rank. You just stood there. And sometimes that's all it takes for people to see the truth." There was a long silence between them. Comfortable. Heavy. Final. By the next sunrise, Monroe was gone. The flag on the hospital lawn dropped to half-mast. Kennedy stood beneath it alone, hand on his heart, eyes fixed upward. Cameras captured the image, but he didn't notice. This wasn't for them. This was for the man who had stood for him, one last time. Later that morning, in a quiet press room in Baton Rouge, Kennedy announced the next step. "I will be introducing the first look standard at the federal level," he said, voice calm, posture unshaken. "Not as a law to punish, but as a framework to educate. A voluntary training program for public-facing staff in hospitals, transportation, city offices, anywhere the first interaction sets the tone for human dignity. We can't legislate kindness, but we can teach it." The press was stunned. They'd expected outrage, not reform. But Kennedy wasn't interested in vengeance. He was chasing something harder, something slower. Culture. In the weeks that followed, the momentum didn't die. It spread. A coffee shop in Ohio put up a sign, "Ask first." judge never. A sheriff's department in Nevada held a town hall and streamed the Kennedy-Monroe video before the discussion. A group of college students in Oregon created a free online toolkit for empathy-first customer service. Even the security company that employed Miles Dutton issued a statement, not just apologizing, but committing to adopt the first-look standard across all contracts. Miles himself released a video, trembling but determined, where he admitted his mistakes, thanked Monroe by name, and promised to see people better. But the most powerful moment came from a child. A 9-year-old girl in Mississippi stood up during a classroom presentation on heroes and held a drawing she'd made. It showed 2 men, one in a suit, the other in a wheelchair. "This is Senator Kennedy," she said, "and this is Mr. Monroe. He saved the senator, but the senator saved his voice." The room fell silent. Her teacher, wiping a tear, asked, "What does that mean?" The little girl answered, "It means when someone sees you, really sees you, you don't feel invisible anymore." And just like that, the story found its shape, not through breaking news or viral hashtags, but through something ancient and quiet. A reminder that sometimes dignity is the loudest protest. That respect is not a policy, but a practice. That seeing someone fully, regardless of their clothes, their title, or the weight they carry, is the beginning of something better. Kennedy, back in his office, read the story about the little girl. He smiled, eyes full but focused. "She got it," he whispered. He stood, looked out the window at the city below, and knew there was still more to do. Because the headlines would fade, the videos would stop trending. But if even a handful of people paused the next time they stood at a door, a counter, or a line, and chose to ask instead of assume, to welcome instead of block, then the movement had begun. And for once, the quiet man at the center of the storm didn't need to raise his voice. He had already been heard. 1 month later, the auditorium where it all began was full again, but this time there were no protest signs, no angry chants, no media vans parked outside. Just folding chairs, handshakes, and the soft buzz of community. Senator John Kennedy stood at the edge of the stage, watching people file in. Veterans with ribbons pinned to their jackets, hospital staff in Navy scrubs, high school students holding clipboards, small business owners, barbers, bus drivers, everyday people who had shown up not for a fight, but for a conversation. The words, "First Look Forum," were projected in bold letters above the stage. Beneath them, the slogan that had quietly become the heartbeat of a national shift. "See the person, not the moment." Kennedy took the stage without fanfare, without applause, and began speaking in the voice America had come to know. Not polished, not loud, but steady as stone. "Somewhere in this room," he said, "is a person you've overlooked. Maybe it was last week. Maybe it was 10 years ago. Maybe it was yesterday morning when you looked right through someone because they didn't move fast enough, didn't speak clearly, didn't seem important. We've all done it. I've done it." A ripple of quiet acknowledgement passed through the crowd. But here's the truth. Dignity doesn't wait for perfection. It just needs a place to begin, and that place is usually silence, that pause, that breath, that extra second to see the person in front of you before you decide what they are. He paused, scanning the room, not as a speaker demanding attention, but as a man extending an invitation. "That's what Sergeant Monroe gave me on that sidewalk," he continued. "Not just protection, not just memory, but space. Space to be seen when someone else refused to look." The room held still. And then Kennedy did something unexpected. He stepped down from the stage and walked among the chairs, shaking hands as he spoke, nodding to the crowd not like a politician, but like a friend remembering names at a reunion. He stopped in front of a teenage boy in the 3rd row, the same boy who had filmed the video a month ago. "You helped change a country with one clip," he said. "But more than that, you reminded people that stories don't have to be perfect to be powerful." The boy looked stunned. He smiled shyly and gave a quiet nod. Around him, cameras remained down. No one interrupted. It was a moment of mutual respect, not performance. Back on stage, Kennedy returned to the microphone and delivered the final message that would echo far beyond the walls of that room. "Folks, systems change when people do. Laws matter, sure. Policies, programs, penalties, they all have their place. But they won't matter much if we forget the thing they're supposed to protect, the invisible line that runs between one human and another. The moment where a choice is made. Will I raise my voice? Or lower my guard? Will I dismiss? Or will I ask?" He looked around. "We can choose better." A soft applause began. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild, but it was steady, like something real. That night, after the chairs were folded and the banners taken down, Kennedy stood alone at the back of the room. The janitor, a quiet man in his 60s, pushed a mop across the linoleum and said, "You know, I saw the video. Never thought I'd see a man in your position stand still like that. Most folks would have snapped or yelled, but you stood still?" Kennedy smiled. "Sometimes standing still is louder than shouting." The janitor nodded, then added, "Wish someone had done that for me once." Kennedy looked at him. "Maybe now you'll be the one to do it for someone else." And with that, he turned and walked out into the night. No podium, no cameras, just the sound of the door clicking shut behind him, and the quiet promise of a world that, because of one moment, one veteran, one mistake made right, might now pause just long enough to see each other a little more clearly. And for those watching this story unfold, if you've ever been overlooked, silenced, or made to feel small, this is for you. And if you've ever been the one to look past someone, maybe this is the moment you remember to pause. Comment 9 if you believe dignity is a choice. Because this story didn't end at the hospital doors. It started there, and it belongs to all of us now.